Buried deep beneath Texas and Louisiana lies the closest thing America has to a dragon's hoard. Hundreds of millions of barrels of oil stored inside caverns vast enough to swallow skyscrapers. In 2026, a war thousands of miles away forced the United States to begin emptying those caverns. The war between the United States and Iran severely disrupted tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow channel linking the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. Before the conflict, more than a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade and roughly one-fifth of global petroleum consumption passed through that route. When tanker traffic collapsed, the United States authorized the release of 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, or SPR. The oil would enter the market over roughly 120 days. All 32 members of the International Energy Agency joined the response, increasing the planned international release to 400 million barrels of oil and refined products. The action was the largest coordinated stock release in the agency's more than 50-year history. Oil prices influence the cost of transporting food, packages, workers, and passengers. Without the crude stored beneath the Gulf Coast, the disruption could have reached American consumers more quickly. The emergency America had prepared for was finally here, but years of withdrawals and incomplete replenishment had already reduced the reserve to its lowest level in decades. In 1973, Americans waited for hours outside gas stations because foreign governments had cut off part of the oil supply. That October, Arab oil exporters used petroleum supplies as political leverage during the Yom Kippur War. On October 17th, the 11 members of the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries publicly announced an immediate 5% production cut, followed by further monthly reductions until their political demands were met. Over the following days, several producers also stopped shipments to the United States and other countries that supported Israel. Oil prices surged. Some gas stations shortened their hours or ran out of fuel, while lines stretched around entire blocks. The federal government reduced gasoline shipments to distributors and called for stations to close on Sundays. By early 1974, world oil prices had roughly quadrupled. Rumors and uncertainty drove motorists to fill their tanks whenever fuel became available. But this was more than a temporary rush for supplies. The shortage affected the fuel, keeping much of the economy in motion. Domestic wells kept producing, but nowhere near enough to replace the missing imports. New wells, pipelines, and processing capacity could not appear fast enough to close the gap. Military aircraft, ships, and supply vehicles also depended on fuels refined from petroleum. A fuel shock could therefore reach the armed forces as well as the economy. Congress responded by passing the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975. President Gerald Ford signed it on December 22nd, authorizing the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to hold up to 1 billion barrels. The idea was simple: hold hundreds of millions of barrels inside the United States, beyond the reach of foreign exporters and vulnerable shipping routes. The storage problem was not simple. Conventional tanks would require an immense amount of land, steel, security, and maintenance. Along the Gulf Coast, however, the government began looking beneath the ground. Millions of years before anyone thought to store oil there, ancient seas left thick layers of salt beneath Texas and Louisiana. By the 1970s, the oil industry knew salt caverns could hold enormous amounts of petroleum close to Gulf Coast refineries without covering the landscape in steel tanks. They were also much cheaper. The Department of Energy estimates that storing oil in salt caverns has historically cost about $3.50 per barrel in capital expenses, compared with $15 to $18 per barrel for above-ground tanks. In the oil industry, a barrel is a unit of measurement equal to 42 gallons, not a physical drum. Holding roughly 700 million barrels above ground would require an enormous network of storage tanks, fire suppression systems, security, and constant maintenance. The government instead developed 4 underground storage sites along the Gulf Coast: Bryan Mound and Big Hill in Texas, and West Hackberry and Bayou Choctaw in Louisiana. Some caverns already existed. Others were created by drilling into the salt and pumping fresh water underground. The water dissolved the salt and returned as concentrated brine, leaving enormous chambers behind. A typical cavern holds around 10 million barrels and extends roughly 2,500 feet from top to bottom. A chamber of that size could contain Chicago's Willis Tower with room to spare. As of 2026, the reserve consisted of 60 caverns with a combined authorized capacity of about 714 million barrels. The reserve began filling on July 21, 1977, when approximately 412,000 barrels of Saudi Arabian light crude arrived at West Hackberry. Even that first shipment would have filled only about 4% of a typical 10 million barrel cavern. Water creates the caverns, and water later helps force the stored oil back out. When oil is needed, water is pumped into the bottom of a cavern. Because the injected water is denser than the crude, it settles below the oil and forces it upward through another well. After absorbing salt, the water becomes industrial brine, which the SPR disposes of through dedicated systems, including injection wells and controlled offshore discharge pipelines. At Bryan Mound, a 36-inch pipeline carries the brine more than 12 miles into the Gulf. The caverns themselves sit between 2,000 and 4,000 feet underground, while lined wells carry the oil, water, and brine through the layers above. Above ground, the sites look like collections of pumps, valves, and pipes. Almost everything that gives them their scale remains hidden below. The reserve peaked at 726.6 million barrels at the end of 2009. Over the following years, withdrawals increasingly outpaced replenishment. The largest sustained withdrawal came in 2022 after Russia invaded Ukraine. Over 6 months, the government released 180 million barrels. To rebuild the reserve, the government purchased 59 million barrels and accelerated the return of about 5 million owed under earlier exchanges. Congress then canceled several scheduled sales in an effort to keep more oil from leaving before the stockpile had recovered. When war with Iran disrupted traffic through the Strait of Hormuz in February 2026, the government ordered another emergency exchange. By July 17, 2026, emergency exchanges had reduced the SPR to approximately 311.4 million barrels, less than half its authorized capacity and its lowest level since March 1983. While a smaller reserve would not empty gas stations overnight, it would give the government less time to slow the rise in fuel, travel, and delivery costs before replacement supplies arrived. The risk grew once multiple crises began converging. By July 22nd, renewed fighting had again severely limited traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. At the same time, a major Gulf Coast hurricane could damage the refineries and pipelines required to turn emergency crude into usable fuel. The government would have to choose between releasing more oil immediately and preserving what remained in case the disruption worsened. Companies participating in the exchange are expected to return approximately 200 million barrels within a year, including additional oil paid as a premium. Until those barrels return, America has much less room for another crisis.